Ireland, we saw the moment that COVID appeared, the first thing that the pharmaceutical cartel did through its indentured servants in our political process, who are bought, sold, and owned lock, stock, and barrel by Big Pharma, that they began attacking our Bill of Rights, beginning with the First Amendment. Hamilton, Madison, and Jefferson said we put freedom of speech in the First Amendment because all the other rights are dependent on it. If you have a government that is immune from criticism, it has license for any sort of atrocity. And as soon as they eradicated free speech on the internet, in the public square, so people were not allowed to complain about these new policies or to tell stories about their injuries or their experience with these new medical products, suddenly they went after all of the other amendments in the Constitution. The other rights in the First Amendment are the rights to religious freedom, and they got rid of the religious exemptions, which are hundreds of years old, from vaccination. They got rid of next the right to assembly by lockdowns, by social distancing, passing these extraordinary laws with no due process, with no scientific citation, that deprived Americans of their rights to assemble. And then they went after the Fifth Amendment right to due process and just compensation in the taking of property. They closed the businesses of 3.3 million Americans, shuttered. Many of those companies, these small privately owned companies, are now permanently bankrupt. About 60% of Black-owned businesses in our countries will never reopen. And they did that without just compensation, without due process of law, which is required by the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. And they went after the Seventh Amendment right to jury trial, an essential right. Our Constitution says no American shall be deprived of the right of a trial before a jury of his peers in cases or controversies exceeding $25 in value. There's no exception. There's no pandemic exception. And by the way, the framers of the Constitution knew all about pandemics, because during the Revolutionary War, there were two pandemic or epidemics at that time that almost destroyed the American army. There was a smallpox epidemic in the Army of New England that debilitated it in its campaign to take Montreal. And we had a malaria epidemic in the armies of Virginia. So the framers of the Constitution, 10 years later, knew a lot about epidemics, but they did not make a pandemic or an epidemic exemption in the United States Constitution. They said we have jury trials whether there's an epidemic or not. There is no exception. But we have now seen the PrEP Act, the CARES Act, the VICA vaccine Act, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, have deprived Americans of their right to a jury trial if a pharmaceutical product injures you. If any of these countermeasures injure you, you cannot get a jury trial. The company has complete immunity from liability. And of course, that gives them license or any kind of atrocity or bad behavior that they want to commit. There is no accountability. If they poison you, if they kill you, if they lie to you, you cannot sue them, no matter how grievous your injury, no matter how toxic the product, no matter how negligent or reckless the conduct, you cannot sue that company. They got rid of the Fourth Amendment, which is the right against warrantless searches and seizures. The government doesn't have a right to come and ask you about your medical status, the pharmaceutical drugs you're taking, where you've been, where you're going, whether you're locked in your home. But all of this track and trace surveillance and the vaccine passports and the questioning now, if you want to leave your home, if you want to enter a government building or even a private building to go to a bar, to go bowling, to go to a sporting event. Now you get interrogated by your government. So all of these rights, and then the right, of course, to due process of law. In the American democracy, government regulators cannot pass laws without going through a democratic process. They need to give notice of the laws, which has to be published in all the newspapers of record so that people who are affected by those laws are highly likely to see them. They need to publish the proposed rule and then give 60 days or 90 days for notice and comment for people to comment on them and say, wait a minute, that rule is going to affect my business and it makes no sense in my particular business. And the government has to respond to those comments. And then you have a public hearing, you have an environmental impact statement where the government tells the rationale behind the law, the scientific basis for it, where they cite scientific studies and say, these are the studies that underlie our assumption that this law is going to give you the following benefits. And here, incidentally, are the costs of that law. It's mandatory that they tell the costs, that they describe them, that they assess them, and that they measure the benefits against those laws. And then none of that analysis ever happened. We never saw a single law that said, here's why masking works. Here's why lockdowns work. Lockdowns were something that the World Health Organization, the CDC, had traditionally rejected in pandemics. They said they don't work, and that in infectious respiratory diseases, there's no reason for them. The disease is going to spread. And the lockdowns are just going to cause more havoc, more mayhem, more deaths, more injuries, economic dislocations, which are all public health issues. And so none of that analysis for masking, for lockdowns, for vaccination ever occurred. There was no environmental impact statement. There was no risk-benefit analysis. And so there was no informed consent because Americans did not have any capacity to say, what is this vaccine going to do to me? What is this lockdown going to do to me? What is the mask going to do to me? And then, or any kind of macro analysis, what does it do to our society? Will it actually protect us? Will it cause more harm than good? None of that analysis ever occurred. And that is against the law. That's part of due process. And then there's a public hearing where Anthony Fauci and the regulators have to come and bring their scientists and their piles of scientific studies and make a case for the law that they're trying to propose. And the public or people who oppose those laws are allowed to bring their scientists in and to cross-examine the government scientists and to direct examine our own. And this doesn't stop countries from enacting emergency regulations for 2 or 3 weeks or for a short period of time. You can do these things simultaneously, but none of it ever happened. They just got rid of the United States Constitution, which we've always said America is an exemplary nation. When we had our revolution in this country in 1776, we were the first democracy in modern times. By our Civil War, which was 1860 to 1865, there were 5 democracies in the world. And today there's 185 democracies, and they're all in one way or another modeled on the US model. So we have an obligation, we feel, in our country to the rest of the world to uphold democracy, to fortify it, to make ourselves a model for this form of governance. And instead, we were the first people, Ireland as well, to tear it all down. And it's, Ireland is a nation that has traditionally fought for freedom. Ireland suffered as much as any nation probably in the globe. The colonial legacy, in 1847, 1848, as everybody knows, there were 400,000 Irish who starved to death, their lips green, many of them from eating grass. 4,000 ships left the Irish shore, headed for America or Australia. And the Atlantic, in the words of the poet, became a cup of tears. And we benefited from that exodus in our country and even in the Revolutionary War. We had Irish Americans and Irish who were disproportionately fighting among our soldiers. In the Civil War, again, disproportionately, it was largely fought by Irish on both sides of the battle. There are more Medal of Honor winners in United States history with Irish surnames than any other nationality. So these were people who were willing to lay down their lives to fight for freedom, to fight for democracy. And this was happening all over the world, not just in the United States, but Australia and elsewhere. The Irish have always been at the forefront of the battle for freedom, of the battle for democracy. And I so wish that I could be with you today to celebrate this event, because we are at the beginning of fighting back against this totalitarian control. The thing that is going to win this battle is local activism, is people talking to people, or us building bridges and creating infrastructure so physicians can finally speak to each other, how we can create a shadow infrastructure, a parallel government, a parallel medical system where people really can talk about public health, about private health, and can fight for their patients and to become healers again rather than agents of state policy. From the time of Hippocrates, it's been understood that the relationship between a doctor, a physician, and his patient or her patient is sacred. You treat a patient, you're not treating the community. And it's very dangerous when government steps in and tells doctors that they have an obligation to the whole community. The whole patient-doctor relationship is based upon trust. It's based upon my believing that when I go see my doctor, he is treating me as if I'm the center of the universe, that he's trying to heal me, not that he's trying to advance a state policy. And yet that's what's happened during this pandemic. And brave doctors who want to be healers, who complained about that, are marginalized, they're delicensed, they're vilified, they're gaslighted, they're ridiculed, they're punished and isolated. And we need to end that. And the physicians need to be the people who are standing up and are saying, we're not going to take this anymore. And I'm so happy, I'm so proud of my friendship with Robert Malone. There's no physician who has suffered more, who's taken more crap, who had more to win from signing on to this, to this medical cartel. He was at the center of it. He could have cashed a big check and he could have had an easy life. And instead, he did something very, very brave, which is to say, I'm not going to be part of this imposition of medical totalitarianism on the globe. And you know, the biosecurity agenda is not just a function of the medical cartel. It's the intelligence agencies and the military industrial complex now see biosecurity as the spear tip of global hegemony for these entities within our society, these very corrosive entities, the military industrial complex. And they, because of that, because their organizational capacity and their power, they were able to engineer this extraordinary pivot of all the liberal democracies around the globe that overnight switched direction, and the very people who were fighting hardest for civil rights and individual rights became an instrument of this biosecurity cartel. And we need to start fighting back against them. And this meeting is the beginning of this battle in Ireland and on the shores of a nation that's done more to fight for freedom than any country in the world. And I commend you for this commitment. I am with you, although not physically, in my heart, in my spirit, and I look forward to sharing a foxhole with all of you. Thank you.